Good morning. I'd like to call this meeting of the University and Faculty Senate to order. President Gable is unavailable today, so as vice chair, I will be chairing. I want to first thank everybody for taking the time again to be with us to conduct these important governance meetings, and I'd especially like to welcome our new senators. Particularly because we have new people with us, I'm going to go over the protocols for online Senate meetings. In order to help us identify participants, we ask that you please change your display name to include whether you are a senator or not. I believe we might display instructions on how to do that, but if not, if you go up to your entry, you can rename yourself and add whether you are a senator or not. I ask that you remain muted during the meeting and keep your video off unless you are called upon to speak. If you wish to speak, please use the raise hand function so that we can identify that you do want to contribute. When you're called on, you may unmute yourself and enable your video. Voting will be accomplished by using Zoom's polling functions. When a vote is initiated, a poll will pop up on participants' screens. If you are attending and are not a senator, please do not vote. Item 1 on the agenda is a motion to approve the following special rule. Each speaker is limited to 2 minutes each time they are recognized. A 2/3 majority of those present and voting is needed to approve this rule. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. I will ask the host to initiate the poll.
We'll give about 10 more seconds to vote if you wish to vote.
And you are a senator. I should have had a reminder about that.
And last call. There being 134 ayes, 2 nays, and 2 abstentions, the motion prevails.
Thank you. So each speaker will be limited to 2 minutes. Item 2 is a discussion on changes needed to bring the university into compliance with new federal Title IX regulations and a vote on a change to the tenure policy. I'd like to call on Ned Patterson, Vice Chair of FCC and SCC, to present this item.
Okay, thank you, Carol. If we could have the slides, please, Amber. And so I will briefly review the issues raised by the 2 new Title IX regulations and what is driving the changes in university policy we're discussing. This includes the solutions offered by the current proposal drafts. Some of you are very familiar with this. For others, it may be new. As Carol noted, there are new senators as of July 1st. We are trying to avoid too much repetition of what you already know, to leave most of the time for discussion and also time for questions about things that are in this review. Why are we here? Because the Department of Education announced new regulations to implement the Title IX provisions on sexual misconduct. They specify in great detail how the U must respond to allegations, including how investigations, hearings, and appeals must be conducted. We must also be in compliance with the new regulations by August 14th to continue to consider allegations of sexual misconduct and could be subject to withholding of federal funds if we're not. The two biggest issues with compliance: first, we currently have different and decentralized grievance processes, procedures in sexual misconduct matters, depending on whether the respondent is a student, civil service, P&A, bargaining unit, or faculty. And none of those processes are in compliance with the new regulations. Second, we have to use the same standard of proof for all sexual misconduct matters. And we currently have different standards used: clear and convincing standard for faculty under the tenure policy for appeals, and preponderance of evidence for all other processes. Next slide, please. The solution proposed is to establish a system-wide grievance process for all sexual misconduct matters. That will be done through the revised administrative policy, sexual harassment, sexual assault, stalking, and relationship violence. And the revised policy will apply the preponderance of evidence standard to all cases throughout the process. The administrative policy has been rewritten to provide a Title IX compliant process, and that draft has been shared and discussed at many committee meetings, and more about this in a minute. Creating a centralized process also requires a
point of
change.
order. Can I speak?
Who is
This
speaking?
is George John. I'm a CSOM senator.
And your point of order or question?
Is that, yes, the Senate has changed its membership from last year to this year. That, as I understand it, that means that we need to discuss something before motion is introduced, and then we can vote on it after amendments have been introduced, and so on and so forth. As I read the history of this motion, the discussion happened with the last Senate, not with this Senate. So I would like a ruling in that matter. I think Phil or Carol, either one of you, I'm not Robert's maven, somebody can rule on this.
I believe we do not have a distinction between one Senate and the next in that sense, and that there will be discussion. This is the item is being presented, then there will be a motion, then there will be discussion. So we will have discussion today as well, but it continues from the last Senate without, it doesn't, there's no interruption where we have to start over, for instance. And so we will have discussion.
Can I appeal that to the body?
I believe you can challenge the ruling of the chair. The chair has ruled that the order is appropriate and that we will have presentation, a motion, and discussion.
Yes, I'd like to challenge that.
Give me a moment
Sure.
to get the details about how that works. All right, so first of all, the appeal of the ruling of the chair needs to be seconded. Then just as a matter of how this would proceed, we would debate the appeal of the ruling of the chair, and then there would be a vote of the body. So I will first ask if there's a second for the challenge to the ruling.
Point of information.
Yes, go ahead.
Is-
And for each
Oh,
person,
sorry.
actually, please identify yourself and your role in the Senate.
Scott Petty, I'm a student senator. Is this an action of the University Senate or the Faculty Senate?
What is the this you're asking about?
The conversation you're having with
So the university, we are currently acting as the University Senate. We are meeting as the University Senate, concurrent meeting of the Faculty Senate, and the matter on the agenda for vote is simply of the Faculty Senate.
so okay, so then I can second it. I'll second it.
All right, it's been seconded. So now we will have a discussion about the ruling of the chair and whether it should be overruled.
So can I speak?
Wait.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, just I'll have to wait and see who might give a moment for people to raise their hands. But also, if I could ask George, I believe what you're challenging and what exactly you're challenging, so that we know what we're discussing.
Right. So I've been at this university 32 years, and I think the tenure code is probably the most important document to my colleagues, and I suspect most of our tenure track colleagues around the campus. It seems to me that we should be taking every step possible to let people discuss it, allow for amendments, follow the rules properly, and we seem to be rushing this. We've moved from one Senate to another Senate. I thought I was off the Senate, but unfortunately I'm still on it, I gather. I had to double check with Amber on this. So I would like us to just think about how important this step is and to give everybody an opportunity to be heard and to discuss it, and not to have a discussion that's carried over from the previous Senate and then to have a vote on the motion itself today.
And what, just for clarification, we will have a presentation, so information about the item. We will have a motion to consider. We'll have discussion. We'll have further discussion on the floor. We have an hour and a half for the meeting as a whole, and only then will we have a vote. So I'm unclear on the difference.
I'm not a Roberts maven. I rarely speak up in these meetings, but it seems to me that if somebody is going to propose an amendment, it's all so rushed. You have a motion on the floor. If you have an amendment, we have to discuss the amendment and then have probably another meeting to actually vote on it. I can tell you that in all candor, none of my colleagues know what's going on here. So it seems to me that it's just a process that's been involving the committees, and that's about it. The senators themselves have really had no chance to discuss this proposal on which we're going to vote with their colleagues, the constituents. That's my concern.
All right. So I see there are some hands. Clerk, can you tell me who is next?
Yes, the next speaker hand up I see is Chair Phil Buhlmann.
Go ahead, Phil.
I would just like to call on everybody. We've got 1.5 hours today, and let us just use most of that time to actually discuss the issue. I think that would really be most important part, rather than to kind of go forth and back with parliamentary moves. That's all I have to say.
All right, who is next?
Next on the list is Matea Allert.
Matea, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, hi. So I'm a student senator, and I'm a new student senator, and I would just sort of like to support the statements of George John. I think it's important that, we inform the new members of this. And I think just sort of like, having a brief overview and then voting on it is not appropriate, especially sort of considering how serious this is. So.
Thank you. Next. I believe it's
Sorry, Matthew Croft.
It's okay. Go ahead, Matthew.
Yeah, my name is Matthew Croft. I'm a CSC undergraduate senator. While I understand that the rules have, while I understand that the composition of the Senate has changed, the Senate being open meetings has not, and I would say that any people who believe that the business of the Senate is important to them probably should at least be reviewing the meetings that we have. But I think that I actually understand what is being discussed fairly well, and I'm not a tenure track faculty. Basically, from my perspective, what's going on is we have to rearrange how we do the investigation of certain accusations of sexual misconduct because of a change made to the Title IX federal regulations that we would be out of compliance with our current rules. As far as requiring discussion and debate being separately, I would kind of encourage, I looked briefly through the Senate Constitution and bylaws, and I don't really find anything that substantiates this, that there is a changing of session.
30 seconds.
We don't traditionally close our sessions, it seems. Like we change the membership, but we do not say that this is now a meeting of a different Senate. So that's what happens in other bodies when they have elections, that they would then adjourn the Senate entirely and then convene a new one. And we don't do that. It just simply people cycle in and out. So I would definitely encourage people this is very timely and we need to move on with this. Otherwise we may get in trouble. So I would say pay attention very closely. And if we have a problem that comes up, I would encourage you to simply just vote against the motion.
All right, thank you. Next speaker.
Next speaker is Sarani Ranjarahan.
Go ahead, Sarani.
I have 2 points to make. First, the federal rules require us to be in compliance before August 14th. I understand how important the faculty tenure system is. I am confused about what the senator is asking for. It sounds like there's two separate things. It's either a motion to table this motion, or it's a motion to have discussion before a vote. We're going to have discussion before a vote, so that doesn't seem to require changes. And if it's a motion to table, then I would just like to, I think that like if it ends up that the vote is mostly abstain or mostly nay, like we're going to come back here before August 14th. So I would strongly recommend that we use this 1.5 hours to discuss the proposal and like kind of go through the process that the senator is describing, and hopefully, you know, this conversation, which has been ongoing ever since the regulations came out on May 7th, can progress. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I see two more hands, and I would, I'll call on those two individuals, but then I think it will be time to vote on this. I'll add one more point of information as well, but Briggs Topol, go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. Briggs Topol, Student Senate, SCC Chair. I would also like to echo the sentiments of my dear colleague, Sarani. We do need to be in compliance with Title IX regulations by August 14th. That is less than a month from now. And then also in that regard, we also have to keep in mind what the Board of Regents meeting schedule is. And I think that's pretty pertinent as well. In regards to the statement made by my dear colleague from CSOM, I find it interesting to hear that some senators now feel as though they have a full grasp of the situation. And I feel as though there could have been a little bit more consultation with senators. However, yesterday there was an entire university email sent out to everyone from the policy library with exact copies of the proposed policies that we've had plenty of time to review and consult on And today is a testament to that ability to consult on and have a fair discussion on what the specific details of each policy is. And so I feel like today is that discussion and ability for us to all come together and be able to actually move these regulations and the proposed policies forward. However, I would like to push back on the sentiment that there hasn't been enough time to look at these proposed policies as they've been directly sent out to everyone in the university. Thank you.
All right, thanks. And the final speaker, Will Jones.
I just wanted to say that I'm a new senator. This is my first meeting. When the new senators were invited to this meeting, Amber Bathke sent us all of the documents related to this debate. I also received input on the debate from, and all the documents from the Twin Cities chapter of the AAUP with a very clear explanation of what was at stake for the tenure policy. So I just want to make it clear that new faculty are not coming to this without the necessary background to make a decision. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Will. So the point of information is actually something that I was going to add, is something that Briggs mentioned, which is the Board of Regents will be voting on a tenure policy amendment on July 30th. And this is our last meeting before that vote for us to act on this item in all likelihood. So my decision is that we should proceed with the agenda on the docket today. The issue will be discussed, presented, and there will be time for debate. If someone wants to move to extend debate at that point, they can. But at this point, my decision is we should proceed with the agenda on the docket. I ask for a vote. Shall that ruling be sustained? And I ask the host to initiate a poll.
Can I ask whether we're just going to use the poll or something better than the poll to avoid the kind of fiasco we had last time? Is there something like a roll call vote or something to at least make sure that the people are voting and the votes correctly?
We will use the poll. If there are questions about the numbers and they're close enough, we can consider further. We did ask for people to register today by saying whether they are they are senators rather, or not, and that helps us be more certain. And that's a response to the issue that came up last time. So the poll is in process.
We'll ask for 10 more seconds for those who wish to vote. And last call for votes. There being 152 ayes, 9 nays, and 7 abstentions, the motion of the ruling of the chair is sustained.
Thank you. All right, we'll return to Ned Patterson presenting on the item wherever you think you need to pick up. Thanks.
Okay, I think I just had said the administrative policy at the top there has been rewritten, and then creating a centralized process also requires a change in each of the policies listed in the second part of the slide. Proposals to change them to do what we've called a carve out for sexual misconduct matters, removing them from each employee discipline procedures and sending them to this administrative policy. As was mentioned, in addition to discussion of this meeting, as emailed yesterday at 2:49 to all system faculty, staff, and students, there is an open comment period for 10 more days to continue getting feedback about all these policy changes. Next slide, please. This is the proposal for the carve out for the tenure policy, the one that requires a vote by the faculty senate. The others are administrative policies. Most of the carve outs are not voted on, as I said, by the Senate or Senate committees, but they have been the subject of discussion in the appropriate committees and in the Senate at our last meeting. So there has been wide consultation to date. And then on the tenure code policy, there's been with the FCC, the SCC, the combined committees that must be advisory to this, the AAUP, a faculty work group convened by the FCC, and a faculty work group convened by Tina Marison. So there's been widespread consultation to date. The civil service rules do have to be voted on by the Civil Service Senate, and that will happen later this month. Since this is important, the first part, the unhighlighted part, is the carve out. And you can read that, notwithstanding other provisions in its regulations, basically will all be carved out to the administrative policy, sexual harassment. The second part, the highlighted sentence, goes one step further and specifies what the hearing panel will look like under the centralized grievance process. It's indicated that if a faculty member is a party as complainant or respondent, then there will be a faculty member on the hearing panel deciding the case. As indicated, excuse me, in the note at the bottom, is expected, and it is this case at the moment, that the administrative policy implementing the central grievance process will have a provision giving the same right to everyone. So if there's a student party, there will be a student on the panel. If there's a P&A party, there'll be a P&A panel on the panel, etc. It's in the tenure provision, not because faculty will be treated differently, but because it's been seen as important to specify here as well as in the administrative policy that all parties will have this protection. But the tenure code can only speak to faculty rights, and so that's why it's mentioned here. Those of you who have followed this matter through earlier discussions and all the consultations will also see that this highlighted part has been changed from a previous version. It used to have an alternative based on the idea that each party could select one hearing panel member from the list of available members. Discussions with the Board of Regents and others made it clear that this alternative was problematic because it made the process seem less fair because each party would be seen as picking their representative. That wasn't the intention. The panelists are neutral and unbiased, but that was a perception, and those of us involved with the drafting and presentation of the changes agreed that it would be better to focus on having one voice of someone in the same class as the party on the panel rather than picking the panel members directly. Next slide, please. As indicated on this slide from the Board of Regents policy, faculty tenure, the three Senate committees indicated must be consulted for advice on the proposed tenure amendment. There has been robust consultation with these three committees with a number of combined and separate meetings and other committees and groups, as I mentioned, and is also detailed in the docket materials in this compressed time frame, which we do admit, but it has to happen in this time frame. And this was all discussed at the June 29th Senate meeting, and it's all detailed in the docket materials for today. There will be at the end of this presentation reports from the three specified Senate committee chairs at the end of the presentation. And then again, all this is advisory. There will be the faculty Senate vote at the end, but that's advisory to the regents. The regents will make the final decision on all proposed changes, including the tenure policy, at their special meeting on July 30th. Next slide, please. The Faculty Senate Constitution requires that only tenured and probationary or tenure track senators vote on any proposed amendments to the tenure policy. The vote on the tenure policy amendment will take place at the end of the meeting today, as mentioned. The tenure policy in many of its provisions, including the one we consider today, affects all faculty. Although the Constitution permits vote only by tenured and tenure track faculty, consultation has been broader than that. Similarly, comments today is invited by any member of the Faculty Senate, whether or not they can vote for this purpose because it affects them. The other related policy matters on sexual misconduct, particularly the administrative policy setting up the centralized procedure and several other the carve-out provisions are presented today for information, and the tenure policy changes made in the context of all those other policies. Therefore, comments from all members of the University Senate are invited, and that's why we're having this joint and concurrent meeting, even though there will only be a vote on the tenure policy aspect. Next slide. Just a few more details about the central process that is contemplated or in the current draft that was sent out yesterday. You will see that based on consultation, some of these processes have changed a bit in the last week or two. Cases will be heard by hearing panels with now 5 members. That's a change because during the consultation, there was widespread support for the idea of expanding the panels from 3 to 5 members and that suggestion was adopted in the newest version sent out yesterday. One would be a professional hearing officer because it's a complicated process to run, and the hearing officer has to know enough to run the hearings effectively, appropriately, and in compliance with the regulations. The 4 other panels will be drawn from centralized panels. Sorry, let me go back for a second. The 4 other will be drawn from centralized housing committee of faculty, staff, and students from across the university and the whole system who will be trained on the rules and procedures involved. As already noted, sorry, give me 1 second to find my spot. As already noted, the parties will be assured that at least one member of the panel will be aligned with their U status, student, faculty, staff, etc. Beyond that, the expectations of panels will be chosen with the goal of creating diversity and balance on the panel, and that is easier with 5 members as well. Based on the most recent consultation, the hearing committee members will be selected through a process that will involve governance groups. Exactly how that will be implemented is still being worked out. But again, those drafting the administrative policies, Tina and Brian and others have been very responsive to feedback, and we appreciate that. The role of the hearing panels, for all cases, the hearing panel will decide whether or not there was a violation of U policy, and it decides the facts in essence. For students, it would also decide the disciplinary action to be imposed, if any. For employees, the panel would make the recommendation or possible recommendations if there's not unanimity, and that recommendation would go to the person deciding the sanction to impose. The dean or vice chancellor for faculty, the appropriate vice president for other employees. As another new addition last week, if panel members disagree with the recommended sanction, they may recite a dissenting opinion, explain their views to the dean or other authority. Another change based on the feedback is that the university authority will explain in writing their decision on sanctions. Next slide, please. The last piece is to outline the appeals process as currently proposed in the revised policies sent out yesterday. Under these regulations, there has to be an appeal available equally to both parties, and it has to offer an appeal for the first 3 grounds listed: the procedural irregularity, new evidence, or bias. The university is proposing to offer an appeal on 2 additional grounds. Was the decision unreasonable in light of the information presented? Basically, was there sufficient evidence? And was the sanction grossly disproportionate to the offense, to the offense? The appellate officers who the appeal would go to and who would make the final decision differs depending on the university status. For students and faculty on the Twin Cities campus, it goes to the provost. For staff, it will go to the vice president for HR. For faculty, student, and staff and students on Crookston, Morrison, Rochester, and Duluth, it would go to the chancellor. And in each case, a named individual could designate another decision maker. Another provision added again in the last week or so, added based on consultation, is that the appellate officer will issue a written opinion explaining the decision on the appeal. Next slide, please. A few other ideas for our discussion today to ensure fair functioning of the process that will likely lead to some additional developments that could be incorporated before, or the administrative policy can be also amended after August 14th, as it started. There are sanction guidelines for cases involving students currently. There's a link to the docket in those, and there are plans to work towards developing sanction guidelines for a wider range of cases that will be heard under the revised policy. It was previously, to the second point, that either party has 10 days to file an appeal, and that was thought to be short by a number of participants in the consultation. In the newest version, there's 10 days to indicate an appeal is being filed, and an additional 10 days in which to submit the appeal details in writing. So now 20 days. It was also suggested to consider restorative justice in the mix of remedies and actions. That's for further discussion. And lastly, as a way of understanding how the process functions, to develop consistency and as a check back on fairness, there will likely be some kind of periodic reporting of outcomes to the hearing committee as a whole and to governance groups as well, with private and confidential information, of course, removed. Next slide, please. And I turn it back to Carol now.
Thank you, Ned. I would like to call on first Phil Buhlman, chair of the FCC and SCC, to make the motion on behalf of FCC.
Thank you, Carol. So before I make the motion on behalf of the Faculty Consultative Committee, let me just very briefly emphasize two important points. First of all, let me say that I've been in governance for 10 years and my reflex has always been, don't open the tenure code. I would not start my first Senate meeting as FCC chair with this motion if I were not absolutely sure that we thought through this very carefully and that we really have no other option. The motion that I will present to you shortly is the result of extensive consultative process that Professor Patterson has described to you, and as we're also going to be briefly shown by the committee chairs before we open this for discussion. And second, the Faculty Consultative Committee has voted on this motion over this past weekend. And of the 13 FCC members who are eligible to vote, 1 member was unable to vote, 1 member voted with an abstention, and 11 FCC members voted yes. There was no nay vote. So let me move ahead and make the motion. The motion is to recommend the following proposed addition to the Board of Regents policy, faculty tenure. There will be added a section 10.4 subheading that will contain the following 2 sentences. Notwithstanding other provisions in these regulations, the process for decisions and appeals regarding disciplinary action in response to complaints against faculty for alleged violation of the Boards of Regents policy, sexual harassment, sexual assault, stalking, and relationship violence will be conducted under the administrative policy, sexual harassment, sexual assault, stalking, and relationship violence, and related procedures. The administrative policy will provide that there will be a faculty member on the hearing panel for any case in which a faculty member is a party. This is the end of the proposed addition to the Board of Regents policy, faculty tenure. I give it back to Professor Chomsky.
Thank you, Phil. And as mentioned now several times, the faculty tenure policy requires or says that the Senate should seek the recommendation of several particular committees before it decides on its own recommendation. And I will now in sequence call on the chairs of those committees to provide consultation and recommendations from their committees. So first, Becky Youst on behalf of the Judicial Committee.
Thank you, Carol. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Just want to let the Senate know that the Judicial Committee met last week on Monday, July 6th, to discuss the proposed administrative policy and the change to the tenure code. The committee was supportive of the addition of subsection 10.4. The committee also provided feedback to Tina Marison about the administrative policy and procedures. The committee's concerns at that time primarily were about the makeup of the hearing panel and the appellate process. Our discussion was robust and concerns were listened to seriously. Changes made since our meeting addressed many of those concerns while not necessarily adopting the specific suggestions. But we're pleased to see the consultation that has changed this policy over the last week. Thank you.
Just a second. I am, sorry, I'm dealing with a technical issue on my end. There's but let me move on and try to deal with that on the side. Sorry. I will now call on Cliff Steer for the Senate Committee on Faculty Affairs.
Carol, thank you very much. And I hope you can hear me, and good morning, everybody. So just in brief review, in order to comply with these new federal regulations on Title IX, it was necessary to implement a number of changes to university policies and procedures related to sexual misconduct, investigations, and proceedings. A working group led by Professor Ned Patterson, who presented a very clearly designed slideshow this morning from the College of Vet Medicine and the SCC Vice Chair, was convened to put together a number of draft recommendations, which we have considered over the course of the last, I think, probably 4 to 6 weeks. And over this period of time, the working group has consulted with a number of stakeholders, including P&A and civil service, student sexual misconduct, Senate Judicial Committee, Equity, Access and Diversity, Academic Freedom and Tenure, and my own committee on faculty and affairs. In fact, I chaired a joint meeting with SCFA, AFA, and T, and EAD last week. Now, I just want to also underscore the fact that at a recent meeting, the Board of Regents discussed in detail proposed changes to university policies. They were presented with university staff and leadership recommendations that would institute a single system-wide grievance process for all university members, create a system-wide hearing committee of trained faculty, staff, and students from all 5 university campuses to serve as decision makers in hearings, to allow full advisor participation in hearings, to update the appeal processes for both complainants and respondents, and to apply the preponderance of the evidence standard in all sexual misconducts. Now, the view of our Committee on Faculty Affairs has been very positive towards the myriad recommendations that we've discussed and been privy to over this last 1 month, and one in understanding the circumstances that we must act quickly, judiciously, and in support of Title IX and its execution on this campus by August 14th. Thank you very much, Carol.
Thank you, Cliff. I would next call on Gopalan. Am I still being heard? I'm really having technical problems on my end, so sorry about this. Gopalan Nadathur on behalf of Academic Freedom and Tenure.
Yeah, so you are being heard, so I'll pick up now.
Yes,
so
thank you.
Freedom and Tenure Committee hasn't actually met explicitly to discuss this proposal, but its members have been involved in the overall process, as has been highlighted by Professor Steer and also mentioned by Professor Woolman. Despite the fact that we haven't met as a committee, I have polled members in the committee and have got some feedback from them and so forth. So through these email communications, I have a sense of what the committee members feel, and that's what I'm going to tell you. Okay, so first thing is that a lot of the committee members have serious hesitations about making changes to the tenure code under this kind of time pressure, not unlike the kinds of hesitations that Professor George John was expressing. But there's also resignation to the fact that we need to do this fairly quickly. The need is forced on us. Okay? Now, given those circumstances, the next question to consider is if the changes that are being proposed will harm the tenure code. And our sense was that narrowly carving out the part that deals with sexual misconduct is probably the best way to go. It's the least obtrusive way of realizing the need of the moment. And then furthermore, we have looked fairly carefully, I mean, individually at the proposed centralized procedure. And our sense is that the kind of procedure that is being proposed is not likely to harm the idea of academic freedom that the tenure code is seeking to protect. And on the contrary, it might also have some beneficial consequences from the perspective of how sexual misconduct is dealt with on the campus. Okay, so overall, we are guardedly optimistic about the changes, and most of us, my sense is, are supportive of them, given that we have to make them.
All right, thank you, Gopalan. And now we open the floor for discussion, and I will ask the clerk to indicate who has hands raised for me.
Yep, the first hand raised is Scott Petty.
All right, Scott, go ahead.
Hi, so I have one procedural question for Phil that I'd like answered last, and then 2 technical questions for Ned. For Phil, I just would like an explanation of what does the motion failing mean in practical terms as a matter of process. But for Ned, I had two technical questions related to the slides, slide number 7 and slide number 8, if they could be put back up. Whether it's Amber or Jeanette running the slides.
I'm working on it. I had closed the document, so I now need to reopen it.
It's basically just there were 2 points where I was talking about mappings from individuals to specific parts of the process. And I was just wondering about when there was conflict, when people involved mapped to different people, basically. So on slide 7, it talks about how members of the panelists will align with party's university status. What's a party? And then is the process constrained in such a way that there's only one respondent? And so is presumably a party is either a respondent or a complainant. And then does this then assume that there's only one of each, that the process doesn't then involve multiple complainants or multiple respondents? My question is just like, what happens when this gets complicated? When you have to map the individuals involved into the panelists. And then on slide 8, it talks about how the final say for the grievance appeal, or the final say for the appeal. Amber, can you move up to slide 8?
30 seconds.
Yeah, so the appellate officers are the provost for student or faculty and VP of HR for staff. What happens if the complainant and respondent are on opposite sides here, and then their appeals then go to different people?
Yeah, I could try to answer that as best I can, and I may let Tina jump in. Presuming in most cases that there's one complainant, one respondent, then in the panel of 5, there will be one in each of their categories in the panel, and the secretary and the panel director would potentially decide the others, but that's still open to further discussion. I don't honestly know if there's more than one complainant or respondent, exactly how that will work, so I'll defer to Tina. And then I believe on the appellate officer, I believe that's whoever is the respondent, the one who's being alleged against. But Tina, can you clarify those?
But complainants are supposed to be able to appeal.
So I think Tina can clarify that.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Scott. So in terms of your first question, the policy and the new regulations do provide in some cases that there could be multiple complainants or multiple respondents in one case. If that was the case, I think we would make sure that there was one panelist from the classification of each of the parties. So complainants and one was a student and one was a staff and the respondent was a faculty, we would have one of panelists who was staff, student, and faculty.
So Tina, my pain in the butt question is, you have 5 panelists and you have 5 panelists and 5 categories plus an officer. What happens what happens in the nightmare scenario where you end up with 5 people from 5, you end up with all 5 categories checked? Does the person from your office then have to be a P&A employee or something?
I think the way that we've set it up is that under the policy and procedure is that if it is a staff member, regardless of the staff classification, there will be another staff member. So that is the obligation under the policy. So if we had multiple types of staff members, the policy would just require that we have one staff member on the panel. Final.
you. And then the second technical question was when you have a respondent and a complainant whose final appeal authority are different people.
Yeah, that's a good question. So Ned is right in that it would be the status of the respondents that would govern that decision. So let's say we had a complainant who is a student and a respondent who is a faculty member. Both parties would have the opportunity to appeal, but the appeal would go to the provost based on the respondent status as faculty member. And the reason for that is that it is a finding against the respondent and discipline of the respondent that is being considered. So the decision maker would be someone who is in a line to oversee the respondent.
Thank you, Tina.
Was there an additional question that still needed to be answered?
I asked Phil what happened if there was a no vote.
Okay, Phil, go ahead.
Thank you, Scott, for a truly outstanding question. So just to repeat that, because it's such a good question. So the question is, well, what will happen if this motion does not carry? Well, essentially the outcome would be that there would be no recommendation from the Faculty Senate going to the Board of Regents. And the Board of Regents would likely just make up their own solution, which in my personal opinion would be a huge loss, because over the last couple of weeks, as it has been just described now, a lot of feedback from all across the university has been collected. I'm particularly thinking right now about a suggestion from a student senator from Duluth who recommended that there should be a different time considered for appeals, actually something that has already been implemented now in the proposal for the policies that have been shared yesterday with everyone. There have been input from civil service, from P&A, from students, from faculty. So I do feel that we have come up with a best case solution, and that's what we're proposing to the Board of Regents. What I'm most worried about is that if this motion does not carry, that the Regents will come up with their own solution that will not be as thoughtfully thought through as what we have come up with. Scott, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you, Phil.
All right, next speaker.
The next person with their hand raised is Greta Friedman Sanchez.
Okay, go ahead, Greta.
Thank you for taking a look again at making changes to the administrative policy and the accompanying documents. So I have two questions and a comment. My questions are the informal resolution. I don't understand why refusing to participate in informal resolution is considered retaliatory. And the second question is, how is the information collected during the informal resolution used in a grievance process if there is no resolution during the informal phase and it needs to move forward? And my comment is, I support the changes to the tenure code. I think it is a very good idea to have a faculty member in the panel, in a hearing panel, for a disciplinary hearing of a faculty member.
All right, thanks, Greta. I think that perhaps there's, if Tina can respond to the questions that were raised.
Sure, thank you, Greta. So the first question, how is refusing to participate in an informal resolution retaliation? So this is confusing. What the regulations say is that a party or witness's refusal to participate in any part of the grievance process. So say a complainant or a respondent refuses to participate in the investigation, or refuses to participate in the hearing, or refuses to participate in an informal process. If they do that, they cannot be retaliated against for that refusal. So the university cannot take an adverse action against or treat a party negatively because they refuse to participate. I think that what the rules are trying to do is acknowledge that sometimes there are valid reasons that a party doesn't want to participate in the process. For example, in some of these cases, there might also be criminal charges against a respondent, and the respondent's attorney may say, do not participate in the university process because that could compromise the criminal process. And what the regulations don't want would be a respondent to be kind of penalized for that in our process. I think that's what the regulations are getting at, but it is confusing.
So may I suggest that you take a look at the language again, because I read it exactly in the opposite direction. as being retaliatory.
I will do that. Thank you, Greta. That's a good suggestion. As to your other question is, how is information gained during an informal resolution process used in a grievance process if the informal resolution process fails and the case then goes to a hearing process? That is a good question. What the regulations say is that we can offer informal resolution processes that are processes that will provide a way for the parties to voluntarily agree to some kind of resolution that would then end the matter. The regulations say that if we do that, we do have to provide the parties with the information that you suggested. We would need to tell the parties before we engaged in that informal resolution process what would happen to any information they shared during that process, whether it would be able to be used in any subsequent hearing process. As of right now, we don't have any informal resolution process set up that would solicit information from the parties in the policy prior as part of the informal resolution process. So we haven't come to that question of how we communicate that to the parties. I think a real opportunity for us after we get the policy in place is starting to think as a community about what kind of informal resolution processes that we could offer that could potentially offer different avenues for justice in these cases. And as we do that, we will need to make decisions and inform the parties in writing about whether the information shared during those processes could be used in a subsequent hearing. So we have the discretion as the university to make that decision. We just have to communicate it clearly to the parties.
All right, thank you, Tina. Next speaker.
Next I have Karen Sue Talsig.
Go ahead, Karen.
Hi, thanks. So I'm a new senator, and so thinking through this in the early stages for me, and I guess obviously I'm alarmed that we're having a change in policy that's being forced by the current federal administration, because once policy is changed, it's hard to change it again, especially in the tenure code. And so I want to be, I'm very grateful for the thoughtfulness that has, given that, I'm very grateful for the thoughtfulness that has gone into this proposed change and totally recognize the need to be in compliance. I guess my concern is about how well it works down the road and how we get feedback as a body about that. And so I'm just wondering if we should be thinking about having some kind of amendment that asks, and I'm also, given the workload of EOAA, very loath to put something else on their plate, but I am wondering if we should be asking for an annual report from EOAA giving us a sense of how they feel the new policy is working. Whether it's annually or every couple of years, in terms of how they view
30 seconds.
How they view things are working and whether or not they think we should be keeping this policy in the tenure code or if we should be thinking about changing it back, because federal guidelines will change again with new administrations. And so that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Karen. I might just as a point of information suggest that, first of all, as Ned Patterson described, there was already discussion about some reporting mechanisms within the operation of the policies. The Senate will be free to ask for, Senate through its committees would be free to ask for reporting back about how it's operating. And I suspect that so it wouldn't be in the policy, it would be a Senate process, and we'd certainly be free to do that as a Senate or the committees going forward. And I expect there will be substantial interest in that. So it wouldn't necessarily be in the policy, but it would be in Senate process. Next speaker.
Next speaker is Jason Kerwin.
Go ahead, Jason.
Okay, it said that, sorry, I thought you wanted me to turn on my video, but Oh, now you do. Yes. Hi. I'm Jason Kerwin. I'm a faculty senator in CFANS. And it's my understanding that the new regulation requires that the evidentiary standard simply be the same for all of the Title IX cases that are assessed. And what I wasn't clear on is how we came to the conclusion that what we should do is lower the evidentiary standard for faculty as opposed to suggesting that it be raised for everyone. And I don't think that there's a clear cut, like thinking about this and talking to other faculty and just to my friends about this, I don't see a clear cut case why it would be one way or the other, but I didn't see a discussion of how we came to the conclusion that it was what we should do is sort of like, yeah, lower the bar for faculty as opposed to make the recommendation that it be raised across the board. I could see arguments both ways, and I just didn't see this laid out.
Thank you. I think perhaps Ned can talk about the consultation, or Phil. I'm not sure who would best answer the question about the discussions of the standard
I'll be
of
happy
proof.
to let Phil add on if he wants. There was extensive discussion about this, and I also am on the PIPSM, Presence Initiatives to Prevent Sexual Misconduct Steering Committee, and there was that hat too, but also with other faculty, and that generally in civil lawsuits in the federal and state courts, it is the preponderance of evidence standard. So that is the same in the federal courts. It's not this is not a criminal case in this case. So that's more for civil rights. That is generally the standard. And there was concern for the complainants might be less likely to come forward if there was a higher standard, and that this is already feeling more like a trial, but we want it to be more a community and educative system with sanctions that are appropriate. So there was extensive discussion and a general consensus that the preponderance of evidence is better, especially taking into account the complainants, and that is what is in the court system too for civil rights cases. And then Phil, do you have anything to add?
So yes, I mean, the one thing also to remember is that right now, like for 90% plus of the campus, there is that standard of the preponderance of were the exception there. And I frankly also want to point out, we do have to be a little bit realistic. The Board of Regents has very, very clearly pointed out that they do want preponderance. And a second point I would like to add, though, and that is also relevant to the comment of Senator Karen Sue-Tausig. Well, first of all, I do want to say that, yes, that I totally share the level of concern and frustration about the fact that the federal government requires us to make these changes so quickly. I think everybody really who has been looking at this carefully will agree with that. But I do want to also point out that there is a positive point about the fact about these changes that we are making, as I've mentioned in numerous venues. I've already pointed out 4 years ago to Tina Marasam that it would actually really make a fairer process if we did have some type of panels. And I think complying, or we're taking the opportunity to comply with these federal regulations to also implement these panels, which I think is really a great step forward into creating a fairer process really for all parties involved. And that also addresses the point that Karen Sue-Tausig has made when she mentioned, well, it will be hard to undo the changes. Well, actually, on one hand, those of us who have been thinking about how we should change the tenure policy, we've thought very, very carefully about actually minimizing all possible changes to it. That's why we're coming up only with 2 sentences. That's really the minimum that we feel, or the maximum that we really want to do. And it's really a minimal change, but that will achieve the goal. At the same time, I also feel like I don't want to jump too quickly to a conclusion. Well, how quickly can we undo that change in the future? Because I do think that the panels are really a great step forward. And so we may not want to be too fast with trying to think to eliminate that again, but rather actually see how that works out. And I believe will improve the process here on campus. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Next speaker.
Next, I have Ellen Messer-Davidow.
Go ahead, Ellen. Okay.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. I'm just totally confused. So I would like a little clarity on why the proposed Title IX policy revision has a dual location on the university's policy landscape. I understand that the federal government requires compliance with the new Title IX regs. And I understand that that means for many universities, including ours, that we have to revise an existing policy. And the proposed policy revision will be in the category of administrative policy. Yet there's an addition to the tenure code referencing that faculty will be subject to this new administrative policy. And earlier I did hear some concerns about changing or tinkering with the tenure code. Why do we need anything in the tenure code when the language of the policy in the administrative precinct includes faculty?
So I can perhaps, just in the interests of time, try to answer that since we are running lower on time and we still have a number of hands. The faculty tenure policy would continue to apply to these circumstances, and we would have a conflict between the two. And we would be not following the tenure policy as it is written if this carve out is not put in place. So even though the administrative policy would be in conflict with the tenure policy, and that's not a position we wanted to be in. And so in order to have faculty governed by not the tenure policy, which would be inconsistent with the Title IX regs, but governed by a procedure that is consistent, the carve out is necessary. Otherwise, the tenure policy would still apply and faculty would be bringing, claims might be brought through that policy for disciplinary action, and it would not be consistent with the Title IX regulations.
So bottom line, the tenure policy contained grievance language that was deleted and replaced by C, administrative policy X.
The tenure policy, the civil service rules, the P&A governing grievance policy, all of them would apply to those categories of individuals. And if nothing is carved out, so we're not taking anything out. If this is approved, it would not take anything out of the tenure policy. It would simply add a carve out to say whatever else it says in the tenure policy, which it continues to say for all other matters of discipline of faculty, that would simply not apply in these kinds of cases. So it leaves everything in place. That's true of all the other policies as well. It would leave it in place for, as my understanding, it would leave it in place, leave those policies in place for every other kind of discipline, for every individual in the university, depending upon their category. But these kinds of cases would simply be in this centralized process. So nothing is being taken out of any of the policies. The only thing that is being put in is a carve out to say, but not these policies, but no, excuse me, but not these kinds of misconduct claims. Hopefully that clarifies. Next speaker.
Next, I have Jerry Cohen.
Go ahead, Jerry.
Sure, I'll leave the video off for bandwidth reasons, but I'm a member from CFANS and a member of the SJC. I just wanted to reiterate what I said at the SJC, in that because you haven't changed the review process here, that this fundamentally changes the basis for tenure in that you can now have a totally administrative removal of tenure faculty member, which basically eliminates the academic freedom aspect of tenure. You could envision, for example, a socialist economist who got national attention and became notorious, where 4 or 5 right-wing male students filed a harassment charge against her, and that the administration would in favor of removal of that notorious professor for own reasons. They have control over the panel composition. You may not think so, but it's really administrative. And the appeal would then go to only the provost or the chancellor. And therefore, you could remove tenure without a faculty review, without any kind of judicial review, for example. And so tenure no longer has the academic freedom protections that we dearly love. And so without some kind of modification of the appeal process to bring it into coordination with our typical academic freedom needs, this would be.
All right, thank you. I think you were cutting in and out, but I think you're done, best I can hear. Next speaker.
Next, I have Ryan Elliott.
Go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah, thank you. Ryan Elliott, Faculty Center, Senator from CSE. As I understand it, this would now create a part of the tenure faculty code that could be changed without a vote of the Faculty Senate. And so I'm wondering if that is true, and if so, if there was a consideration of requiring a Faculty Senate vote on any changes to the university sexual harassment policy.
Phil, I'm just figuring out who might answer that.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is that for policy, usually that is not being voted upon in the Faculty Senate. However, as with any other policy, there's extensive consulting going all across campus, and so surely the faculty would have input on any changes in the future possible changes in that policy.
All right, next speaker.
Next speaker is Rose Vukovic.
Go ahead, Rose.
Good morning. I have a question with, and I tried to ask this the last Senate meeting, but I'm a faculty center in educational psychology, and I also serve on the student sexual misconduct subcommittee. So I'm having a hard time I don't know if it's because I'm used to that process that it's hard for me to hear what's happening, but it's unclear to me what the role EOAA plays. And because currently what happens in the student process, at least, is EOAA makes the initial recommendation, and we, the Student Sexual Misconduct Subcommittee, we are the appeal process. And this is different. And my understanding is it's different in that the panel is the initial recommendation. And so the appeal process is, I think this is what's similar to what Jerry was saying, the appeal process becomes what for us is so it's like 2 steps instead of 3 steps. And so I guess that's where I worry is that what role does EOAA play in that determination? Because that's really important for us as panel members. And then this idea that the appeal isn't a panel seems problematic. So I guess just some discussion or clarification about that.
All right, Tina, perhaps you can respond.
Yeah, thank you, Rose. So currently in our student process, as Rose was discussing, EOAA, my office, does the investigation and makes an initial finding. Then there is a hearing that is adjudicated by a panel from the SSMS, which Rose has served on. That panel makes a decision in student cases on whether or not the respondent violated university policy and on any disciplinary sanctions. There is also a third step in the student process right now, which is an appeal of the decision of the panel to the provost or the provost designee. So in employee cases, we have currently only really had a shorter two-step process currently until now, where EOAA investigated and made the decision on responsibility, the decision whether the respondent violated university policy. And there was no appeal or review of EOAA's decision. So what we're doing now under this proposed system is actually setting up the employee cases like the student cases are set up now. So we're proposing that in employee cases, EOAA will conduct an investigation and make a recommended finding. Then there will be a hearing panel with 5 panel members, 1 professional officer and 4 from the community. And they will have a full hearing and make an independent decision. They don't have to defer to EOAA's investigative report. That is there as evidence for them to consider. But the panel will make an independent decision of whether the respondent violated university policy, and a recommendation on discipline to the dean if it's a faculty case, or the vice president or a high-level supervisor in staff cases. There still is another level of review after the investigation and hearing, and that would be that both parties can appeal to the provost. So it is a 3-layer process, just like the student process is now.
So can I ask a clarification to that? Because currently it only comes to the SSMS if the respondent or the claimant challenges the EOAA report. Not everything gets a hearing. So is it the same? Will that be the same for this? Or are you saying that everyone will get the hearing no matter what?
So that is a good point. That's a part of the process I didn't mention, which is in student cases, and now we will be offering this in employee cases too. After the investigation, there'll be an investigation report with a recommended finding. That will go to the decision maker on discipline, who can choose to offer an informal resolution to the parties. So if EOAA recommends that we think this is a case where there will be a finding, that our report will go to, say, a dean in a faculty case, and the dean could say, okay, I want to propose a 6-month suspension. That proposal would then go to both parties, the complainant and respondent, and they could both agree to that in writing voluntarily as an informal resolution, at which point the case would end, or either of those parties could request a hearing before a panel. So we are building that same informal resolution option after the investigation into employee cases, with one caveat. The regulations do not allow us to offer informal resolutions in cases where there's a student complaint against an employee. So that won't be offered then, but it will in all other student and employee cases.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Tina. Phil, did you want to add anything?
Yes, let me briefly comment. I think one thing that has not been mentioned by anyone, but I may have missed this, is there's also always an additional possibility of an appeal to the Minnesota Court of Appeals. So that would be yet kind of another layer to add there. I also want to acknowledge that among the committee members that were consulted, and the various committees that were mentioned earlier, there was initially a feeling that, well, there should be a appeal panel rather than an appeal officer. And so that thought was thought through very carefully, I feel. There was a concern that adding there an additional layer would extend the whole process. And I think one thing we also need to acknowledge is that the new federal regulations will make it harder on victims with the whole cross-examination that has to happen now. That will be tougher. There's a big concern that fewer victims will be willing to speak up. And so we didn't want to really lengthen the whole process. And so adding a whole appeals panel was perceived as a way to, or would have possibly an effect of really lengthening the whole process, which already is now very long. And so actually increasing the size of the hearing panels was kind of a bit of compromise. And I again want to go back and kind of look at what we currently have. Currently for faculty, EOA makes a recommendation. And with all due respect to EOA, I do have to say, I think that by EOA not having any student members working there, or no faculty members there, and no civil service or PNA, I think there are some simply experiences, some views, some understandings of how the process works at university that are possibly missing at how currently the EOA would actually come to a conclusion. And so I do feel that actually having the panels, and as a result of that kind of revised concern about the appeals process, having increased the number of panels and making sure that there is one person at least on that panel that comes from the employee category, I think that really strengthens the whole process. So we do have to understand that there's also that concern that the whole length of the whole process also should be a length that is reasonable to victims. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. So I'll just mention we have 4 people, I believe, in the queue now, and it is the meeting is scheduled to go till 11. Call on the next person, clerk.
Jonathan Sachs is next in line.
Go ahead, Jonathan.
Hi, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Sachs. I'm a faculty senator from the College of Science and Engineering. My understanding from the presentation, and I apologize if I missed something, is that as things stand, the process for selecting the 5 panel members remains unclear. If that's true, I'm wondering whether it's problematic that defining the process of choosing panel members is being left for later. So I hope someone could clarify 2 things. 1, what is the process for determining who the panel will be or how the panel will be selected? And 2, why is it okay that we're voting on this before we know about that process? Thank you.
Tina, Phil, Ned, I'm not sure who would want to respond.
I can start, and then Ned and Tina can see what to contribute. I think that, again, actually it kind of goes exactly in the same line as the comment that I made before. There was certainly concern that from the faculty's perspective, that there would be kind of some of that process would move away from influence from faculty. And to that extent, I think faculty spoke on behalf of, well, themselves, but also on behalf of civil service, of PNA, of the students, by really suggesting that the pool of panelists should really be created by suggestions from students and faculty and civil service and PNA. And that's quite solidified now in these policies. So I think that actually is maybe another reason really why I'm confident that that panelist system will actually be a fair process. Ned, Tina, do you want to add to this?
I guess not. I haven't heard others. Next in the queue, Chris.
Next, I have David Andow.
David, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm not going to turn on the video for bandwidth reasons. I have to say I agree with Phil's frank assessment that this is an anti-victim sort of administrative change, and that's a great concern to me. And I guess I have a simple question, which is, do all cases of sexual misconduct, sexual harassment have to be covered under Title IX? So that's a simple question. And you know, if it does look like this process is discouraging victims, which is what we expect, is there some way to either undo it or sort of take a step back, keep the things that look like they're working better, but sort of make it a little less onerous for the victims in the future? Thank you. Those are 2 questions.
Tina, I think you might be best to answer.
Yeah, thank you for the question and comment, David. I'll answer the second one first, which is, and we've heard this from others, you know, we're having to put together this new policy and procedure, which I think has been thoughtfully done, but we've had to do it faster than any of us would have liked. And I think that really calls for a good deal of review and an iterative process over the coming months to see how it goes, to monitor, to report back to governance how it's going, and to continue to refine, make sure that we are creating a process that those who experience sexual misconduct can find usable, and also that, you know, produces fairness for both parties. In terms of your question about whether the Title IX regulations apply to all sexual misconduct, the answer is no, and this is kind of confusing. Title IX regulations only apply to sexual misconduct that meets certain definitional and jurisdictional standards. So, for example, Title IX regulations don't cover certain types of off-campus conduct. They don't cover conduct outside of the country, such as on study abroad or an international research station. They also don't cover certain types of sexual harassment that are currently covered by our policy. The proposed policy does continue to prohibit the broad forms of sexual misconduct that we do now, but we do have to distinguish between whether it's prohibited by Title IX or not. So to answer your question more finally, we don't have to apply all of the Title IX regulations to that conduct that happens outside of the country or in an apartment building off campus that's not covered by the regulations. There are some fairness issues to think about there that it's hard to cover in this short time period. You know, such as, would it be fair to apply a different process to a sexual assault that happens on campus as opposed to one that happens in an apartment building across the street from campus between our community members? Given those types of equity concerns, what we propose to do in the policy is we've created one process that applies to Title IX and non-Title IX conduct and complies with the regulations. But we have carved out a couple of what we see as the more problematic pieces of the regulations from non-Title IX cases. So for example, in non-Title IX cases, the policy allows for an informal resolution in cases where there's an employee complainant or a student complainant and a faculty respondent. So in those cases, the parties wouldn't be required to go to a hearing because we're allowed to do that because it wouldn't be Title IX conduct. We also have a couple other carve-outs intended to not apply regulations that we think will have a negative effect where we don't have to.
All right, thanks, Tina. 2 more people left on the queue. I believe, Chris, can you identify the next speaker?
Yeah, Gopalan Nadathur.
Go ahead, Gopalan.
Yeah, so I just wanted to echo some of the sentiments that were expressed by Jerry Cohen as well as Jonathan, and maybe 1 or 2 other people. It said, I worry a little bit about things going out into the administrative realm, and in particular, I am worried about the fact that we don't have something written into the procedures about how the hearing committee is going to be determined, which is an important component. I feel that should be part of the procedures, or at least there should be some way for people to weigh in, right? People meaning students, staff, faculty, etc., to weigh in and have a strong voice in determining how that is going to be set out. The second thing is that, notwithstanding what Phil said, I'm not really convinced that the argument of timeliness of justice sort of overwhelms the need for another panel, an appeals panel, as opposed to just one individual as part of, so to speak, the administration making a decision on appeals. So those are my 2 reservations, and I would hope to see them dealt with in some way, even though I'm largely in support of the proposal that we are debating today.
Thank you. And the final speaker,
Final speaker, Scott Petty.
go ahead,
Hi.
Scott.
Hi, I'm Scott Petty. I'm a student senator from CFANS. I wanted to ask a follow-up out of intellectual curiosity. Faculty senator for my department, Jason Kerwin. Just kind of my understanding of his question was, so there's this disconnect between standards and procedures that exist for faculty and the standards and procedures that exist for everyone else. And we're being told, and the federal regulation says these have to be brought into alignment. And his question was, well, why is the faculty standards and procedures being lowered down to those for students and staff, et cetera, rather than everyone else being moved up to the threshold for faculty? My understanding of his question that I didn't then understand the answer is, who made that decision? When was it made? Where was it made? How, why, et cetera? Like, how did the discussion and conversation become this conversation as opposed to the kind of contrapositive or inverse or whatever of making everything else look like the faculty process rather than making the faculty process look like the student process?
So I will make an effort to answer that, having been involved in many of the discussions and the consultation. There was consultation in addition to consultation with governance. There was consultation with PIPSM, and Phil might be able to talk about that, but it's the issue of the standard was discussed. It was in the initial policy draft. It was discussed and referred to and on the table at each of the consultation meetings. So every consultation included the possibility of talking about that. But there seemed to be a general agreement that on behalf of complainants, on behalf of those who believed that they were the subject of sexual misconduct, that it was inappropriate to raise the standard higher to make it harder for those claims to be successful in the face of what was identified by one of the speakers earlier, of the difficulties put in the path of complainants by the new regulations, and therefore the process that has to be adopted. So it was discussed, it was mentioned, it was part of the consultation all the way through. So it was part of the overall decision. I believe there are no more hands, and the agenda, we reached 11 o'clock. So it is time to take a vote. Before we take the vote, I will just mention that a number of the things that have been mentioned about further development and further consultation and how the members will be the members of the hearing committee and therefore panelists will be chosen there's been a lot of active consultation and a lot of movement and change on those issues as we've gone through this process, and I expect that will continue. The policy does not speak to that. It typically would not speak to that, I think. So that's what's on the table now, but this is not the end of the consultation on how that process will work with respect to reports and discussions about the operation of it. All right, so it is time for the vote on the motion. I would remind members that only because of the contents, the requirements of the tenure policy, only tenured and tenure track faculty who are members of the Faculty Senate should vote when the poll is put up. I will ask then for that vote.
We'll give it about 10 more seconds for those who desire to vote. And last call. There being 76 ayes, 11 nays, and 6 abstentions, the motion prevails.
All right. Thank you, Chris. Thanks to all of you for your attention to this obviously important issue to many. With that, I will first wish you all a safe and productive rest of the summer, and then ask for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Do I hear a second?
Second.
I thank you.
And again, another 10 seconds. And final call. There being 145 ayes and 1 nay, the motion prevails.
Thank you. We are adjourned, and I will see many of you one way or another